Have you ever loved someone so quietly? The world never knew. Tonight, drift into the hidden pages of Ibn Sina's life, where wisdom met longing in whispered moments with a vizier's daughter, in candlelit libraries and shadowed gardens. A secret affection bloomed beyond the reach of fate. If this tender tale soothes your soul, feel free to like and subscribe, and gently settle in as the story unfolds. The sun had barely touched its peak over the domes of Bukhara when Ibn Sina arrived at the Vizier's estate. He was not yet the legend he would become, though his name had begun to echo softly through libraries and lecture halls. Just 18 years old, he was already physician to the royal court, his wisdom outpacing many who were twice his age. The Vizier, a man of influence and quiet pride, had summoned him not for medicine but for conversation. He admired the young scholar's mind, and in truth, so did many. It was said that Ibn Sina could diagnose illness by the tone of a man's voice, and compose philosophy that made old clerics pause. The estate garden was where they sat beneath cypress trees and fig branches, with the air carrying the scent of orange blossoms and ink. Here, the Vizier hosted scholars, poets, and officials. But today, there was someone else among the gathered guests. She stood near the edge of a marble fountain, her veil loose around her shoulders, not in defiance, but in ease. Her name was Layla. She was the Vizier's only daughter. Ibn Sina had heard of her rumors whispered in court corridors and madrasas. She was said to be clever, fluent in Persian poetry and Arabic astronomy. Some claimed she once corrected a cleric in public, gently but accurately. Others said she read more than most scholars allowed their daughters to dream. When their eyes met for the first time, it was not dramatic, it was quiet. A glance paused, then dropped respectfully, but something remained in the air, like the light, scent of jasmine that lingers even after the breeze has passed. The Vizier, unaware or perhaps pretending to be, invited Ibn Sina to stay for tea. They spoke of the caliphate, of new translations from Greek into Arabic, of medicine and the stars. And when Layla passed, the cups her eyes lowered, her voice soft. Ibn Sina noticed the faint ink stain on her fingertip. She wrote, that night, back in his modest study. Ibn Sina could not quite recall the words of the Vizier, but he remembered the tilt of her head, the way her voice had curved, like poetry over the word wisdom. The next day, he returned under the pretense of delivering a rare herbal text. The Vizier welcomed him again, and in the days that followed, Ibn Sina found himself more often beneath the cypress trees, always bringing a scroll, always hoping Layla might pass by. She often did. Sometimes she asked a question. Sometimes she offered a correction to a quote he hadn't realized he missed. Once, she handed him a scroll of her owner, commentary on Al-Farabi's metaphysics. He read it twice that night in Bukhara's garden of ink and thought. Two minds had begun to walk gently alongside one another. No promises, no poetry, only quiet recognition. A young scholar, a Vizier's daughter, and a connection not yet named, but already deeply rooted. The lessons began under the guise of formality. The Vizier, proud of his daughter's intellect, had long sought a worthy tutor, someone who would not simply indulge her interests, but challenge her thinking. Ibn Sina, already a rising star in both medicine and metaphysics, was the natural choice. And so, 2 mornings each week, beneath the silk canopy in the garden or behind the carved cedar screens of the estate's inner courtyard, they studied. Would arrive with her hair veiled in the modest style of her station, a leather-bound notebook pressed to her chest. Ibn Sina came always with scrolls, astronomy charts, philosophical commentaries, and medical treatises written in the looping scripts of old scholars. At first, their conversations were careful, shaped by custom and distance. "What do you see when you look at the stars?" he once asked her, motioning to the parchment between them. She had traced the lines of the constellations with her finger, then looked at him not, the paper, and replied, "I see stories, but I want to understand the science that holds them." Together, he smiled then, just a little. It was the first time he realized she wasn't only curious, she was relentless in thought. Like him, over time, formality softened, though neither stepped beyond propriety. Something unspoken deepened. Between discussions of Aristotle and Galen, they began to speak in subtler languages. Glances that lingered a breath longer, pauses filled with a silence that was not empty, but charged with meaning. Layla often posed questions designed not just to challenge, but to hear his heart. What makes a man wise? Can one love both truth and beauty equally? Which heals deeper knowledge or time? Ibn Sina, normally swift in thought, would answer slowly with her, not to impress, but to reflect. He found her presence calming, as if the world's complexities became gentler in her company. One morning, while they studied on the terrace, a breeze scattered loose parchment across the stone floor. They both reached to catch the same page. Their hands brushed. Neither spoke of it, but after that, the lessons changed. He began to choose scrolls with care, ones that he knew would spark discussion, ones with margins wide enough for her notes. She started arriving a few minutes early. Sometimes she brought figs, sometimes poems. One day she gave him a small carved stone with the word sabr, patience, etched into it in delicate Kufic script. "I thought you might like to hold something. That doesn't speak, for once," she teased. He laughed softly. "Then I will treasure it. The silence is rarer than words." By candlelight, in rooms meant for scholarship, something tender had begun to grow. It lived in the space between questions, in the way she looked up from her notes when he was deep, in explanation, in how he noticed when she was tired and shifted the lesson toward poetry. They were not lovers. They were not even friends, by the definitions of courtly life, but they were something shaped by shared thought, by respect, by the ache of closeness never named. Outside the estate, the world moved with its usual force. Caliphs rose and fell, cities argued, and scholars debated loudly in courts. But here, between scrolls and glances, a quiet story unfolded, and neither of them wanted it to end. The palace library was a place of refuge, its thick stone walls sheltering thought from the noise of power. Light fell in golden strips across the floor, filtered through stained glass windows. Dust floated gently in the air, and the scent of aged parchment mixed with sandalwood ink and beeswax candles. It was here, beneath tall shelves lined with texts, in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Syriac, that Ibn Sina and Layla found a new language, one of open books, left carefully on shared benches. By now, the court had changed. Tensions brewed between ministers. Rumors swirled of shifting alliances and uneasy eyes on the Vizier's influence. There were whispers of dismissal, even danger, and though Ibn Sina remained in the Vizier's favor, he had become cautious. The palace, once a haven of learning, now echoed with footsteps that listened more than they walked. So the open exchange between teacher and student softened into subtler forms. Layla would visit the library in the late mornings, when the older scribes took their tea. She would leave behind an open book, its page folded to a poem, a footnote underlined, a question lightly penciled into the margins. Later, in the quiet hours of dusk, Ibn Sina would return. He would sit where she had sat, reading the lines she had left him. He responded not with ink, but by placing a second volume beside hers, one that built upon the idea, or perhaps challenged it. It was a conversation without voices, a gentle dance of minds across pages. One evening, she left an open scroll by the works of Arazi. In its margin, she had written only, "If the body holds memory in its illness, what does the heart remember when it breaks?" He stared at the line for some time. Then, slowly, he closed the scroll, placed a tiny pressed blossom between the pages, and slid it gently back onto the shelf. Neither spoke of these exchanges aloud. Not at court, not in passing, but the silence between them grew rich, not hollow. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the library's stone corridors, briefly, carefully, just a glance. But in those glances were days of shared thought, unspoken warmth, and a longing restrained by propriety. Outside, the Vizier's enemies grew louder. There were dismissals, sudden changes in appointments. Even Layla's presence at courts became limited. Still, the books kept appearing, and when he could not find her message one morning, Ibn Sina felt a quiet ache in his chest he had not known. He carried that night. He left a line in a volume of ancient love poetry. "If the world grows too loud for words, meet me in the quiet between pages." He never saw her write again in that library, but some weeks later a scroll appeared at his bedside, left by an anonymous hand. It held a single line of Persian verse, soft as a whisper. "You are the margin in every page I read." In a world of shifting loyalties and crumbling trust, their connection remained a sanctuary, one not built with hands, but with thought, memory, and quiet affection beneath candlelight and curtains. As the palace shifted with politics and whispers, Ibn Sina found solace in pages. But increasingly, it wasn't the texts alone that soothed him, it was the silent presence of her handwriting. The delicate curve of her thoughts nestled beside old ink and ancient wisdom, in the margins of medical treatises and philosophical scrolls. He began to see traces of her heart. Her notations had grown softer, more personal. She no longer asked only of science or language. Now her questions were quiet keys, unlocking doors no one else saw. Can truth and longing walk side by side? If silence holds love, does that make it louder? How do you teach what cannot be named? He never wrote answers in replying not directly, but his choices of scrolls, his placement of poems, the way he left certain lines underlined, became responses. It was a conversation shaped by restraint, but alive with feeling. Once, in a medical journal about the healing of invisible wounds, he left a pressed almond blossom between the pages. When she returned the same book days later, the blossom was still there, dried, but intact. Below it, in delicate script, she had written just one word: understood. It was not love in the form the world would recognize. There were no confessions, no exchanges of tokens or whispered promises. But it was love all the same, carefully wrapped in dignity, hidden in the folds of culture, custom, and caution. Late one evening, as a storm passed over the city, Ibn Sina stood at his window, watching the lanterns flicker in the wind. He thought of her, perhaps, reading by oil lamp, her fingers stained with ink, her mind dancing somewhere just beyond reach, and for the first time he whispered her name aloud, just once, to the room, to the dark, Layla. No one heard him, but the shadows, but it felt like an oath. The next day, in a thick commentary on ancient ethics, Layla had written something new, even if no lips speak it. I know. He closed the book, pressed his hand to the page, and smiled. In a court where eyes always watched and words were dangerous, they had built a language entirely their own, one of margins and meaning, of shared silence and soft defiance. It was not loud, it was not known, but it was real, and it was growing. The wind over Bukhara turned sharp that season, cutting through the palace walls like rumor through marble. Whispers had been rising for months. The caliph's court was restless, fractured by ambition, burdened by war, and uneasy with the influence of men like the Vizier. His intellect, once admired, had begun to feel threatening, and at his side stood Ibn Sina, the young physician whose mind was sharper than most swords, and whose presence invited quiet envy. It began with small things books removed from shelves, scholars reassigned, titles delayed. Then, suddenly, the Vizier was dismissed, and with him, every name tied too closely to his cause. One early morning, before the sun had climbed above the mosque domes, soldiers arrived at Ibn Sina's residence. They said little. He was to be held for questions, nothing more. No cause given, no trial promised. He went without resistance, in the cold stone chamber beneath the palace, stripped of scrolls and stars. Ibn Sina sat in silence. The walls were damp, the hours long, but his thoughts were not on politics or betrayal. They were on Layla. He didn't know where she had gone, only that the day after the Vizier's disgrace, her quarters had been shuttered. Some said she had been sent to a family estate in the north. Others claimed she was cloistered with relatives, hidden. From further scandal, to him, she was simply gone. He held on to memory, her voice threading through ancient verses, the way she turned pages with care, the quiet strength in her gaze when she asked questions no one else dared to ask. Days passed, then weeks. In the shadows of the prison, he began to scratch notes into the stone with a small shard of pottery, grams, formulas, and fragments of poetry he could still recall. And in the middle of a rough drawing of the solar system, he wrote her name, Layla, hidden between the orbits. Sometimes he imagined her walking among her father's old gardens, her eyes scanning the horizon. Other times, he imagined her reading alone, silent, her fingers tracing empty margins where his replies used to be. Outside the palace, the city stirred with uncertainty. The Vizier's allies had scattered. Many scholars fell silent. Some were exiled. A few disappeared entirely. But Ibn Sina endured. It was not the first time his mind had brought him danger, nor would it be the last. And through it all, one thought steadied him. If she still lived, if she still remembered, then no prison could fully confine him. Love, after all, had always lived in quiet places, between candlelight and curtains, between books and breath, and now, in the stillness of stone, it lived again, soft, waiting, and undefeated. The prison had no windows, only a small opening near the ceiling where light filtered in like a faded memory. Time passed in soft shadows. Guards came and went, their faces changing, but their silence remained. Ibn Sina, ever composed, did not beg, he did not plead. Instead, he wrote, not with ink, but with memory. He reconstructed treatises in his mind, and medicine, logic, and the stars, but within one, hidden in a section about the properties of healing herbs, he wove something else, a poem, soft, secret, carefully crafted to carry a message only one person would understand. He dictated the essay aloud to a sympathetic guard who had once been treated by him, a man whose mother, Ibn Sina, had cured years before. The guard, moved by quiet loyalty, agreed to deliver the pages to a trusted bookseller outside the city, someone who often sent manuscripts to private estates. The essay traveled through hidden hands, marked as a scholarly work, and in the middle of it, embedded in a section describing the effects of camphor on the heart, lay these lines: between silence and sandalwood, a breath still lingers. If the stars are hidden, follow the curve of memory. A name carved gently, in thought, still waits beneath the jasmine. It was not signed, but Layla would know. Far to the north, where the wind rustled through slender poplars and the call to prayer echoed softly in the hills, Layla received a package from an old bookseller. She opened it with trembling hands, her fingers cool despite the warmth of the room. She read the treatise first with care, then paused when her eyes fell upon the poem. Her breath caught. No one else would have noticed it, not even the meaning, if they read the lines aloud. But she did. She read it once. Then again, slowly, she placed her hand over her heart. Later that night, by the light of an oil lamp, she penned her reply, a letter, but a verse of her own, woven carefully into the margins of an old commentary on Aristotle. She left it with the same bookseller, wrapped in cloth and sealed with her family's emblem. Days later, the guard handed Ibn Sina the book without a word. He opened it beneath his blanket when no one was watching, and there, in the margin near, a passage on love and perception, were her words. I count your name in my silence, folded like prayer in every breath. Jasmine still grows beyond the garden wall. I am waiting, in thought, if not in step. He closed the book gently, pressing it to his chest. The prison around him blurred. Just for a moment, in a world of chains and veils, they had found a way. Cipher of the heart. The prison gates opened without ceremony. No grand pardon, no public decree, just quiet instructions and the muffled sound of boots on stone. Ibn Sina stepped into the morning air, free but uncelebrated. The world had shifted during his confinement. Courts had changed, allies had vanished, and the city that once whispered his name now looked away. He did not return home. Instead, he chose the road, wrapped in a long, travel-worn cloak, a satchel of books over one shoulder and a vial of ink tucked into his belt. He became once again what he had always been at heart, a seeker, not of fame, but of understanding, not of glory, but of meaning. Across dusty roads and mountain passes, he journeyed, sometimes alone, sometimes under the protection of a prince or nobleman who needed healing. His reputation preceded him, but he never lingered long. He spoke softly, worked swiftly, and departed quietly at night. In the tents of generals or the guest rooms of scholars, he would sit by lamplight, copying ancient texts or composing new ones. Often his thoughts drifted to Layla in the corner of a journal. He carried close. He kept her poem, the one written in the margin. It had faded a little, but he had memorized every word. It became his anchor, his breath between breaths. Occasionally, in bazaars or village inns, he would hear whispers. The daughter of the old Vizier was seen near the Zand River. She had taken up residence near Nishapur. She had joined a household of women poets in Ray. He never chased these rumors directly, but his roots curved gently toward them, like a river turning toward familiar soil. Still, their paths did not cross, but he left traces for her, just in case. A book delivered anonymously to a women's library in Isfahan, with a dedication hidden. In the 3rd chapter, to the one whose silence carried me farther than sound. A jar of rare ink sent to a merchant near Kasvin, sealed with a symbol only she would remember, the almond flower pressed in her first letter. Sometimes he would stop beneath a cypress tree, rest his back against the trunk, and close his eyes. The wind would whisper through the leaves, and in that hush he would imagine her perhaps walking through a courtyard, perhaps looking up at the same sky, perhaps remembering him. He was a physician to kings now, but in the quiet parts of his soul, he was still only hers, still the man who taught her beneath the vines, who read her thoughts in the margins, who spoke her name only when no one could hear, and always, always still searching. Hamadan sat quietly at the foot of the mountains, wrapped in wind and stone. The air was thinner here, cooler, touched by the scent of pine and aged earth. Ibn Sina arrived not as a guest of court, but as a man seeking rest, his limbs weary, his breath slower. Though his mind still burned like a quiet flame, he was offered residence in a small villa just outside the city walls, its courtyard filled with apricot trees and narrow pools that reflected the sky. It was peaceful, unbothered by the urgency of politics. Here he could write, heal, and think in silence, and yet it wasn't the stillness that held him. It was the whisper, the bookseller's wife, while pouring tea, mentioned a name without knowing its weight. There's an old estate in the hills, just past the stone bridge. They say a noble woman lives there, quiet, kind, a scholar of some sort. Rare to see her, but some call her Zara. That name meant flower. It wasn't Layla, but something in the description, her silence, her solitude, her habit of walking. The gardens at dusk made his breath catch. He didn't go immediately. Days passed, then a week. He walked the edge of the hills, always stopping short of the bridge. Instead, he sent a book, a slim volume bound in deep blue leather, containing essays on celestial medicine. He left no name only, a pressed violet between its final pages. It was the flower Layla once tucked behind her ear in the garden of their youth. 2 days later, a servant from the villa delivered a small parcel to the local physician's villa. Inside, a folded slip of parchment, just 5 words. The stars still speak softly. No signature, no seal, but he knew. The next evening, he crossed the stone bridge. He did not enter the estate. He stood outside its boundary wall, under the shade of an almond tree, and waited. Birds stirred in the branches. The sky softened into lavender. And then, between the trellised vines, a figure appeared draped in a soft green shawl, walking slowly, pausing near the gate. Neither spoke. He bowed his head slightly. She did the same. The moment was small, gentle, woven in silence, but in it the years folded. The poems, the glances, the long nights beneath stars, they were not gone. They were simply waiting for the right wind to stir them. He did not approach. She did not ask him to, and that was enough for now. The villa glowed with low amber light as dusk settled over the mountains. A dinner was arranged, formally at the request of a local noble who claimed to suffer from sleeplessness and stomach pains. A quiet affair, a guest list of only 5. Ibn Sina arrived in simple robes, the color of riverstone, carrying his satchel of remedies. He was announced with minimal ceremony. No titles, no praise, just a nod. She stood at the far end of the courtyard, framed by lanterns and jasmine vines, veiled. Yes, but unmistakably her. Layla. She greeted him with the same elegance that once moved through palace gardens. Her voice, when she spoke the expected pleasantries, was calm and distant, but her eyes met his with a warmth that flickered beneath the surface, like fire beneath incense smoke. The meal was quiet. Conversations wandered through polite topics, weather, crops, the health of the aging Vizier in Ray, but between each course she poured the tea herself, and each time her fingers brushed the edge of his cup just slightly longer than custom allowed. Later, under the pretense of showing him the herb garden where the household grew its medicinal plants, she led him through a narrow passageway lit with hanging lanterns. The garden was still, wrapped in shadows and the soft hum of night insects. They walked without speaking. When they stopped near a pomegranate tree, her hand rested gently on the wooden railing. "I read your treatise on the influence of emotion on the pulse," she said softly, not looking at him. "Your argument about how longing alters the rhythm of the heart. Was it a theory or something lived?" He turned toward her. "It was lived," he replied. Silence wrapped them again, more tender than tension. She looked up, the veil still drawn lightly over her lower face, but her eyes shimmering. "I never married," she whispered. "Not for lack of offers, just none with eyes that understood mine." He stepped closer, not enough to breach the boundary, but enough that she could feel his nearness. "I traveled half the world searching for clarity," he said, "but only one thought ever stayed." She smiled faintly. "I kept your letter, the one hidden in the book. I stitched it into the lining of my travel satchel." That was all. No embrace, no confession, only two hands resting on the same wooden rail, two breaths rising into the same mountain air, and the lantern between them swaying slightly in the breeze, casting soft golden light across the pages of an unwritten ending. That evening, after the guests had long departed and the villa had quieted into gentle stillness, a chessboard was brought to the study. It had been hers, once ivory and ebony carved into quiet elegance, the pieces worn smooth by years of careful thought. Layla sat by the window where the moonlight spilled in soft white ribbons. Across from her, Ibn Sina placed his hands on the table, steady and thoughtful. No words were exchanged at first, only the movement of the pieces. Pawn forward, knight turned. Bishop swept silently to one side. Outside, the wind rustled the olive branches. Inside, the air was thick with all that had never been said, not because it was forbidden, but because it had always been too deep, too sacred for casual speech. She looked at him between moves, her gaze calm, unflinching. "Do you ever regret," she said softly, "not saying more when we were young?" He moved a knight, slowly. "I said it," he murmured, "but only in ways you had to read between the margins." She smiled faintly, touching a pawn with her fingertips, "and I heard it only in the quiet between your lines." The game continued. Though neither of them seemed to care who won, their conversation was not loud. It wove through pauses, through glances, through the low creak of the wooden table and the soft clink of pieces moved and placed. He spoke of his travels, of courts that offered him titles but no peace, of nights where he wrote treatises with her name tucked silently behind every metaphor. She spoke of days spent in gardens, of poems composed in moonlight, of sitting at the edge of letters never sent, and yet no promises were made, no futures carved from hope. They both knew the world they lived in. He was a scholar bound by duty, by wanderings, by service to rulers and restless knowledge. She was a woman of name and silence, living a life just outside the boundaries of power. Always watched, always waiting. There was no room for possession, but there was space for understanding, for the curve of a queen beside a king on a carved board, never touching but always protecting, always near as the game drew to its quiet close. She stood. "I won," she said with a soft laugh, tilting her head. "I let you," he replied. They didn't hug, they didn't linger, but as he gathered his cloak, she walked him to the threshold. There, beneath the arched doorway, the night air stirred between them like a held breath. "I will write again," he said. "I know," she whispered, "and I will read between the lines." The door closed softly behind him, and in the study, the chessboard remained still warm from their touch, holding between its squares the tender memory of a night that needed no prescription, no possession, only presence. The new Sultan's palace in Isfahan shimmered with grandeur, domes gilded in gold, courtyards filled with citrus trees, and corridors that echoed with the footsteps of men plotting over scrolls and maps. Here, Ibn Sina resumed his role as physician and advisor, a man of knowledge more prized than any jewel. Yet within those ornate halls, he walked as if in a dream. His chambers were filled with books. His days were spent lecturing scholars, healing the sick, and writing treatises that would live centuries beyond him. People praised his brilliance, bowed before his intellect, hung on his every word, but the room was always colder when dusk fell, because she was not there, far away, in a villa beyond the Zagros mountains. Layla was no longer free. News arrived in the form of a sealed letter, delivered without ceremony. She had been married, quietly, honorably, to the son of a governor, a match of convenience, of political stability, a joining not of souls, but of names. No letter came from her, not even a line. Ibn Sina read the news without reaction, then folded the parchment and placed it between the pages of his treatise on the balance of humours. He sat at his desk, quill in hand, and began writing, but the words that came were not medical, they were simple. We live for the mind, not the heart, but the heart remembers anyway. That night he did not sleep. Instead, he walked the courtyard beneath the stars, remembering the sound of her laughter echoing in tiled halls, the warmth of her gaze across a chessboard, the feel of silence shared between two people who knew they could never speak freely. In the days that followed, he returned to work. He debated scholars with ease, prescribed cures with precision, and walked the marble halls like a man of absolute purpose. But his robes, though rich, carried the quiet ache of absence. His oaths were to learning, to logic, to the betterment of mankind. But in the hidden corners of his mind, behind diagrams and scrolls, lived a woman with jasmine in her hair, and a voice he would never hear again. And though he never spoke her name, it hummed beneath every breath. The lamps in Ibn Sina's chamber burned low, casting amber shadows across the scrolls that blanketed his writing table. Outside, the palace had quieted only the occasional rustle of silk from passing guards, or the faint hush of wind weaving through open windows disturbed the stillness. But within his quarters, something stirred. Not illness, not politics, but something far more unspoken. Ibn Sina's hand moved across, parchment slowly, not to compose another treatise on medicine or metaphysics, but something different, something he had long avoided putting into formal words, a reflection on the soul's ache. He titled it only in private, Risalat al-Ishtiaq, the treatise on longing, It spoke of love not as mere affection or desire, but as a sacred yearning, a fire planted by the divine within the soul, guiding it home. He wrote of glances that revealed hidden truths, of silence more eloquent than speech, of hearts tethered beyond time and distance, and in the margins so faint that only he would know they appeared, verses written sideways, slanted like petals fallen in wind. Her name, Layla, never written in full. Sometimes just the Arabic letter lamb-tucked into the curve of a philosophical argument. Sometimes a reference only the two of them would recognize. A flower mentioned in a poem they once discussed. A date, a metaphor about chess. A line of Ibn Arabi that she once whispered back to him. He never read it aloud, never shared it with his students. The treatise was folded gently, wrapped in soft cloth, and placed beneath the wooden floor panel behind his cot. A secret offering, a page of the heart, hidden among tomes of the mind. In public, he remained what the world knew him to be, a healer, a sage, an architect of reason. But in solitude, when the night grew long and the oil burned low, he would sometimes slide the panel open and touch the edges of that secret parchment. Not to read, just to remember it was there, a part of him that chose not to forget, a part that refused to silence love, even if the world had. The great scholar had begun to slow, not in thought, never in thought, but in step, in breath, in the quiet labor of rising from his writing mat each morning. The physicians he once taught now watched him with reverence and worry, offering tonics and rest, but he knew the body, like a lantern, grows dim with time. In the twilight of his days, Ibn Sina no longer traveled. He remained in Isfahan, in a modest chamber filled with books, scrolls, and the soft scent of clove and rose oil. The gardens outside bloomed gently, but he no longer walked their full length. He had lived fully counseled sultans, healed princes, written volumes that would echo through centuries, and yet, as he stared at the curling edges of a scroll or the dancing light of a single candle, it was not debate or applause that lingered in his thoughts. It was Layla, not her. Face not anymore. Time softens even the sharpest memory. But her presence, her essence, the feel of her voice beside a library wall, the meaning in her silence across a chessboard, the scent of jasmine in a hall too quiet to forget. He closed his eyes, resting his head against a rolled cushion, and remembered the letter he had never sent, the one he had written after hearing of her marriage. It remained hidden, folded in a medical text beneath his cot. It was written not in grief, but in quiet release. Your silence did not hurt me. It preserved us both. He murmured the line aloud now, not to anyone, but to the stillness. Servants came and went. Students tiptoed. His pulse weakened, but his soul was wide awake. He began drafting a final treatise, not on medicine or stars, but on hikmah wisdom. It spoke of the unity of all things, love and reason, body and soul, the physical and the divine. In its opening lines, he wrote, "True wisdom is knowing what cannot be taught." And in that moment, what he had never spoken, what he had only ever hidden in margins, now poured freely in thought. He did not regret his choices, only that he had not held her hand not once, but even that felt less like sorrow, and more like sacred restraint. Love, he now believed, did not always need to be lived in the world to be real. It only needed to be remembered. The rain arrived softly, brushing against the tiled roofs of Isfahan with the sound of 1,000 whispered farewells. Inside the scholar's chamber, the light was low, golden and steady. A small oil lamp flickered beside a tray of ink pots and parchment. Ibn Sina lay propped against cushions, his breath shallow, but his gaze clearer than it had been in years. That morning, the servants had opened the door to a veiled woman in simple silk. She carried no guards, no titles, no gifts, only a quiet stillness, as if she had been walking through years, not streets. They let her in without question. Layla stepped into the room like a memory. Returning home, she removed her veil with care. Time had brushed her face with soft lines, but her presence was unchanged, calm, dignified, gently radiant. For a long while, she said nothing, and neither did he. There was no need. Their silence was no longer the one of longing or restraint. It was something else, an acceptance, a shared breath after a life of unspoken devotion. She sat beside him and poured tea, not from ceremony, but from habit, as if they had done this every evening. He watched her hands move the same grace, the same poise. He smiled. "You are late," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes shining gently. "You waited longer than most would have." He laughed, though it came as more of a breath. "I waited in the margins of books, and I found you there," she whispered. The rain continued, tapping against the shutters like soft fingers on a drum. They sat together for an hour, or perhaps 3. Time no longer moved in the usual way. He told her nothing of pain, of death, of what would happen next, and she asked for no promises, no confessions, no apologies, only this moment. Before she left, she placed something on the floor beside his sleeping matter, small folded cloth. Inside, a page torn from a book he had once given her. The poem was faded, the edges curled, but the ink was intact. In silence, we speak. In absence, we remain. She kissed his hand gently, reverently, and covered her face once more as she turned. To go, he whispered her name just once. She paused, then nodded and disappeared into the rain. That night, Ibn Sina slept more deeply than he had in many seasons, and though no records would ever note her visit, and no title ever joined their names, the room remained filled with something greater than love. It held peace. The chamber was quiet, except for the soft rustle of parchment and the distant call of evening prayers drifting through the windows. Ibn Sina lay still at last, his body spent but his mind serene. Around him, scattered scrolls and books bore witness to a lifetime devoted to knowledge, healing, and hidden dreams. His hand, once so steady in writing formulas and philosophy, now rested gently on a folded letter his final words never meant for any other eyes. Days passed before the letter was found, tucked beneath the pages of his last manuscript. It was addressed simply to Layla, whose name lives in every line I have ever written. The letter spoke softly of love as a sacred mystery, not a possession. He wrote of longing that transcended distance, of a heart forever bound by quiet affection. Though the words were tender, they held no regret, only gratitude for the brief moments they had shared beneath the stars and scrolls. By then, living far away in the calm of a distant estate, received the letter years later. She traced the familiar script with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of years fold into a single breath. In that moment, the past felt alive, not lost, but kept safe in ink and memory. She folded the letter carefully, placing it beside a pressed rose, the same flower that had once blossomed in the gardens where they met and in the quiet of her chamber. She whispered a prayer for the man who had never ceased to be her secret, her scholar, her heart. The palace garden lay bathed in the gentle glow of twilight. its paths winding softly beneath ancient trees and blooming jasmine. Layla moved slowly among the familiar stones and fragrant flowers, her steps light despite the years etched upon her face. The scent of roses filled the air, a delicate reminder of times when youth and hope had intertwined beneath these very branches. She paused beside the sundial, a quiet monument to moments shared in silence and shadow. With careful hands, she placed a single crimson rose at its base, the same shade as the ones that once bloomed in the hidden corners of her heart. No one in the court knew the meaning of this quiet offering. No letters, no words, just the rose, a secret kept by the stars and the soft night wind. And in that stillness, Layla found peace. Her story, like the bloom, would live on in whispers, in the rustle of leaves, and in the tender light of distant memories. In grand libraries and dusty archives, the name of Ibn Sina shone brightly, a beacon of wisdom, medicine, and philosophy that spanned centuries. His writings were studied by scholars across distant lands, his legacy celebrated as one of history's greatest minds. Yet, beneath the towering tomes and glowing praise, a quieter story remained largely untold. The story of a woman who had walked alongside him in the shadows, Layla, the Vizier's daughter, whose presence lingered in the margins of his manuscripts and the folds of his heart. Her name was seldom spoken, her existence a delicate whisper between the lines of history's loudest voices. While the world remembered the scholar's brilliance, the woman who inspired his deepest thoughts remained a silent figure, her story wrapped in the gentle folds of forgotten time. It was a quiet flame unseen by many, yet glowing steadily in the hearts of those who listened closely. Centuries had passed, and the world had turned many times over in a quiet study beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp. A young scholar carefully turned the brittle pages of an ancient manuscript, one attributed to Ibn Sina himself. Amid the flowing lines of text, her eyes caught a delicate verse written faintly in the margins, almost hidden by time. To the one I could never name, your silence was my cure. The words, simple yet profound, echoed across the ages like a secret song. In that moment, the scholar felt the presence of a love unspoken, a bond that transcended history's forgetting. Though Layla's name was never officially inscribed, her spirit lived in every quiet word, every healing thought, every line of ink that bore witness to a heart quietly aflame. And so, their story, half hidden but never truly lost, continued to whisper, soft as a breath, in the spaces between the stars and pages. And so, the scholar's legacy remains brilliant, vast, and laced with a love the world forgot. In silent verses and unread margins, her name endures, soft as a rose pressed between ancient pages. If your heart felt something tonight, we invite you to explore more quiet love stories waiting on our channel. Is there a historical couple or forgotten love story you'd like us to tell next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you wish, softly subscribe and return whenever the night grows still.